Excellent. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jesse Hager. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Economics and the Labor Studies program. I'm stepping in as the one-time chair of the seminar group. Normally, Robert Chernomis would be hosting this meeting, but he's graciously given me the opportunity to introduce my colleague here. Before we get started, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. The University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So that is our institutional acknowledgement. Our event today explores government programs and policy models often aimed at alleviating poverty and its consequences, both in advanced economies and developing countries. It's important to remember the role that discrimination and past injustice play in the distribution of wealth, income, and poverty today. Explaining and understanding poverty and inequality in Manitoba requires keeping the Canadian legacy of colonialism and residential schools front of mind. This event is part of the Economics and Society seminar series organized by the Department of Economics. Usually our seminars are on Friday afternoons during the regular academic semester, but with our guest today in from overseas, we have a special timing. I appreciate everyone taking an afternoon out of the beautiful summer weather to be with us today. Dr. Fraser is coming from a seminar at the University of Toronto, and he's heading to the Public Management Research Conference in Seattle. So he's stopped by in Winnipeg with us today. The Economics and Society stream of the Department of Economics offers undergraduate, MA, and PhD degree programs. The ENS program stream is a heterodox economics stream. We're policy-orientated, and we have an openness to interdisciplinary research, placing an emphasis on how the distribution of wealth and power affects socioeconomic and the physical environment. So we're sponsoring this today, but we'd also like to acknowledge two other sponsors of the event today, the joint UW Masters in Public Administration and the Duff Roblin Professor of Government, Susan Prentice, is here today representing both those programs, and we have members of the MPA group as well. And we also have the Institute of Public Administration Canada, Manitoba co-sponsoring the event. So thank you, Divya, who's online with us. I guess we can't see them anymore, so I'll try to figure that out after the talk. But they have graciously organized the webinar portion of this event and advertised the event amongst their membership here in Manitoba, possibly across Canada. So we'll have some participants there as well. So let me provide some background on our speaker today. Alec Fraser is a senior lecturer in public policy and management at King's Business School, King's College London in the UK. His research focuses on evidence use, financial incentives and public management reform in the UK and EU countries. He has a particular interest in health and social care. He has extensively researched the development of social outcomes contracts, such as social impact bonds, over recent years. Prior to entering academia, we have similar paths in this way. He worked in government, in the NHS administration and management. He has an MA in public policy and a PhD in management, both from King's College London. Alec's work has been published in journals including Public Administration Review, Social Science and Medicine, the International Journal of Public Management, and Social Policy and Administration. Alec co-edited the book What Works Now? Evidence-Informed Policy and Practice, published by Policy Press in 2019. He's also the co-author of a new edition of Making Health Policy for the Open University Press, published in 2023. Now, Dr. Fraser is here today to speak on the topic of outcomes-based contracting, and he'll be taking an international perspective. Given the students in our audience and the MPA students who are in their co-op right now, before I hand the floor over to him, I'd like to say a few words linking his work to the Manitoba context, and I'll also talk a bit about the interdisciplinary nature of the topic before we dive into a more public management perspective. Now, in Manitoba, we are actually one of the leaders in Canada when it comes to the use of social impact bonds. Social impact bonds are a specific form of outcomes-based contracting for social services. Under a SIB, shorthand, The government contracts with a private sector entity, usually a nonprofit, to deliver on some measurable social outcome, such as reducing recidivism upon the exit of the justice system, keeping children out of care of Child and Family Services, or improving early childhood education outcomes. The private sector partner in a SIB is required to raise the investment to operate the programming intervention that's taking place, aimed at achieving the results which the government is aiming to purchase in a way through these contracts. The principle that the investor puts into the project is, in theory, at least at risk, and they are only repaid if outcomes are achieved as specified in the contract. Although in practice, the level of risk varies from contract to contract from the investor's perspective. The service providers are usually nonprofit organizations. They're hired to deliver the service, and they're normally not paid by outcomes. These contracts span over a longer time frame than a conventional contract for service from the government, often in the range of 3 to 5 years. So in Manitoba, at least 4 social impact bonds have been announced by the government. The Restoring the Sacred Bond project, which is aimed at preventing infants from coming into the care of Child and Family Services and reducing time spent with reunification. The second project is aimed at reducing the number of youth involved in the justice system. The third is a Quit Smoking with Your Manitoba Pharmacist, SIB. I won't say much more about that. And the final one is a social impact bond to support women's heart health. Now, the future trajectory for social impact bonds in Manitoba is uncertain. The current interest in SIBs was tied to the previous Progressive Conservative government, who made a commitment to utilize these tools while in opposition in the 2010s. And at the time, the Greg Selinger-led NDP publicly opposed the use of social impact bonds. Now, the Wab Kinew-led government, the new NDP government in Manitoba, has not taken a public position, as far as I'm aware, on the use of social impact bonds since they won the election last fall. On a related note, and tying relevance to government policies with respect to broader outcomes-based purchasing models, the previous Conservative government also approached the post-secondary sector here in Manitoba to move to a pay-by-results model for university funding. This is based on a model that was implemented in Tennessee, and this again is something that to date has not been pursued by the NDP, and I would say is unlikely to be pursued. But given the change in government, I think it's quite timely that we have Dr. Fraser here to talk about that, given the change in environment and potentially a change in policy on outcomes-based contracting in Manitoba. Now, while SIBs have a practical public policy relevance, my research in the area was also inspired by various strands of economic thought and political economy. In my work with John Loxley, we aim to situate the proponent logic in favor of SIBs in economics contract theory approach, very much relying on the work of Oliver Hart, who won the Nobel Prize for his work in economics on contract theory. SIBs, I find personally very interesting given their complex and chameleon-like nature. From a political economy perspective, if we think of public-private partnerships, which had a much more established literature in economics in infrastructure, very clear battle lines from a political economy perspective, with labor and civil society organizations lining up on one side, and big finance and large international construction firms, and those who propose that greater privatization is required with government services lining up in. SIBs are more complex. They draw on many social democratic foundational ideals, including the need for government intervention to alleviate the socio-economic inequality generated by markets, and the high social return on investment from investment in public services. Political economists, however, will clearly see the alignment of SIBs with neoliberalism, finance, and privatization. Okay.
Sorry, Jesse, while you were speaking, there was a flash about some speakers. You might want to check the chat and check everyone can hear.
Excellent. Can people hear online? Aaron or Divya, would you unmute, mute and speak?
Hello, we can hear, but we cannot see you anymore.
Okay, I'm gonna say my last paragraph here, and then I'll fix the computer. So, well of interest to economists, sociologists, and human geographers, those working in law and other disciplines, most of the scholarly work of outcomes-based contracting has taken place in the field of public administration management. So we have Alec Fraser here today, one of the leading researchers in this field, so please join me in welcoming Alec Fraser. I'll try to fix the camera, and we'll go from there. Give me 30 seconds here. Okay. Can you see us now?
They can see the screen?
Yes, we can.
The camera's working?
Yep, the owl seems to be working and the screen is still up, so we should be good now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Handing the floor over.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jesse. Thank you everyone for making it out on such a lovely day. I really appreciate it. Just for people on Zoom, if anything goes wrong or you lose anything, just shout if you can, and we can start. And more generally, if anyone has any questions as I'm going along, I know this is quite social impact bonds are quite complex and difficult to understand, perhaps. So just if there's anything which is unclear, just stop me at any time. I'll be very happy to try and clarify things for you. So I was going to talk for about 40 minutes. I was going to try and not go any longer than that because I think that's more than enough. Listen to me. I'm trying to do two things with this talk. So on the one hand, this is based on a paper which we've been working on with colleagues for a number of years, which we've just submitted a couple of weeks ago to a journal. So I'm going to talk you through that paper, but the paper itself is a bit of a reflection piece on research we've done over the last 10 years or so. So hopefully it will give you a bit of a flavour about current thinking amongst my research group around social impact bonds or social outcomes contracts. And yeah, I hope it will be of interest. And yeah, just to say thank you as well for the various different departments and people who've sponsored this. I really do appreciate it. It's really lovely to be here. So,
Try down.
Down.
Click forward.
Click.
There we go.
Okay, so a couple of acknowledgements. So firstly to say this paper is it's a collective piece of work. So I just wanted to mention my co-authors. So Claire Fitzgerald, who works very closely with me at King's College, Caroline Heinrich from Vanderbilt, and Mikkel Skard Andersen, who is from Copenhagen. So it's a paper we've been working on for a couple of years together. Second acknowledgement is to Jesse in particular. So I met Jesse maybe 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, kind of certainly pre-pandemic, and then everything gets a bit blurry. I met him at a conference in Oxford, and we had a brief chat there about social impact bonds. And then a few years later, I was approached by a journal to review Jesse and John's book. And being from Yorkshire, a free book was too good an opportunity to turn down. So I said yes. And I very diligently read the book from cover to cover because I was reviewing it. But I really enjoyed reading it. It's one of the best things I've seen on social impact bonds. I think it really distills so many ideas so very well that I just wanted to I acknowledge that and say thank you to Jesse for looking after me so well over the last few days. And I also want to say something about John Loxley as well. So I never met John Loxley, but as I did my review for the book, I kind of Googled around and discovered that sadly he died fairly recently. And I was particularly interested because Loxley, as you can kind of see here, is the village which I grew up in Sheffield. And I understand that John was from Sheffield as well. And so as I read about John, he seemed like a really inspirational figure. And so as someone also from Sheffield to be here, I think it's really nice to kind of just pay homage to John in that way. He seems like a really great person. The only problem I can see is that apparently he was a Sheffield Wednesday supporter. I'm Sheffield United, but I suppose you can't have everything. So yeah, just to acknowledge, John and Jesse.
That would create a real rift.
yeah. So in terms of the talk today, what do I want to talk about? I'm basically talking you through the paper. I shared the paper with Jesse. If anybody's interested in reading the paper, I'm very happy for it to be distributed more widely. As I say, it's out to review. Who knows what will happen, and if I came back and did this talk in a year's time after the review, it might be very different. But I'm going to start by talking about, giving you some background about social outcomes contracts, social impact bonds, and then really talk about some of the work we've done trying to build theory around social impact bonds, very much from a kind of public management, public administration point of view. So a lot of work has explored social impact bonds through a new public management lens, and there's a bit of a debate whether that's the right lens or whether a new public governance lens is better. So we're going to talk about some of that work, and then reflect on some of the more empirical studies which have been done in recent years. And the paper makes an argument that perhaps a hybrid governance approach might be more useful for understanding the strengths and weaknesses of social impact bonds and social outcomes contracts. And then the final thing we try and do with the paper is suggest some potential improvements to the model. So yeah, I think there's things which can be improved with it. So that's what I'll be touching on. So, by way of introduction, this paper's been sort of 2 years in the making. So I went to a session at the Public Management Research Conference in 2022 with a really good panel of speakers talking about theory building from empirical work. And it really got myself and Claire Fitzgerald thinking about, we've done a lot of studies over the last 10 years of social impact bonds using different frameworks, different theories. And we thought, could we kind of bring that together and try and say something more substantive? So we're drawing on work principally from the UK, but also from the US through Carolyn Heinrich's work. I've done quite a bit of work in EU countries, and Mikkel has done work in Denmark in particular. So we wanted to think about how we could bring all this together and write a paper together. And it's been a really joyful process, actually. They're fantastic co-authors to work with, from someone like Carolyn, very experienced, to Claire and I, kind of more in the early, mid-stage of our careers, and Mikkel is finishing his PhD. So it's been a lovely paper to work on, so I'm delighted to be able to talk about it. So, just building on Jesse's introduction about social impact bonds, just to give you my kind of spin on it. So, in terms of the politics of this, initially the social impact bond idea was a New Labour idea. So it emerged under Gordon Brown, sort of in the around 2003 to 2010. Labour were talking about this new model. They got hit very badly by the financial crisis, and for the last couple of years of the Labour government, that was all they were kind of battling with, really. So we had a Labour Party from '97 until 2010, and then in 2010 we got a new government, which we've had for the last 14 years. I don't know if you follow British politics, but I think we've got about another week of these. So very happy to talk more about this later, actually. It's a very exciting time in British politics. So David Cameron was the first Prime Minister who led a coalition government with the Liberal Democrats, and he loved the idea of social impact bonds. They really resonated with his broader policy, which he called the Big Society. So Cameron and his colleagues blamed a lot of the problems of the budget deficits on Labour overspending in the social arena. I think that is contestable. I think in truth they were paying for lots of bailing out the banks, but it fit this discourse around big society, and the big society was smaller government, bigger society. Let's bring in the private sector to help with service delivery. And let's particularly draw on the voluntary and community sectors. Let's draw on philanthropy to try and solve some of the wicked social issues that we're facing. So Jessie talked about homelessness, obesity, employment. These are the kind of things which social impact bonds have been used to try and alleviate with mixed results. So really from 2010, we got the first social impact bond in the UK, focused on recidivism, and as I'll talk about, we've had about 100 in the UK since. But just to give a bit more kind of context, I teach a module on public management reform, and so for my students, I often sort of start in the 1940s in the UK, and the 1945 Labour government really took a kind of a classic public administration approach, whereby policy starts with government, and government will directly deliver services to a specific population. Kind of a one-size-fits-all approach, very much based on inputs, on what government puts in. We then get the new public management reforms of the 1980s, so in the UK, very much led by the Margaret Thatcher administration, so really pushing more management into public services, more measurement into public services, and more markets. So the 3 M's we often talk about with our students when we talk about new public management. And there's a shift in focus towards outputs. Can we get more efficiency into the system, better outputs for our money? Again, this all begins with the government, but rather than government delivering services, government is kind of using logics of competition to get hospitals and other public sector organisations to compete with one another to deliver services for the population. We also see a bit more complexity in terms of community, voluntary sector organisations being brought in more, and also we see a proliferation of lawyers, accountants, kind of around the periphery. So we see that's the kind of change from traditional public administration to new public management. So what does a social impact bond model look like? And the first thing to say about social impact bond is it focuses on outcomes rather than outputs or inputs. And I think this is something which is attractive to everyone. As we're going to talk about, there's a lot of political debate about social impact bonds and ethically, morally, are they the right thing to do? But I think in all the work I've done, I've never done any interviews with anyone who's been against the idea of focusing on outcomes. How we define them, when we measure them, is contested, but I think people are generally positive about outcomes. If you see with the social impact bond, we don't start with government. So we start with an investor, either a financially minded or a socially minded investor, who partners up with an intermediary, with either financial experience, management consultancy experience, or public sector experience. And together they will get some resources, which they will then ask normally a community or voluntary sector organisation to use and lead on delivery of services. Sometimes, or quite often, especially in the UK, will include public sector organisations as well. Another difference is that the services are more personalised. They should be better tailored to individuals rather than one size fits all. Part of the social impact bond ethos is to personalise services. A further change is a commitment to evaluation. So I kind of originally got involved in social impact bonds because I was an evaluator doing evaluations on behalf of the Department of Health ultimately, and we were asked to evaluate some social impact bonds. So as an evaluator, we kind of weigh up the pros and cons. We look for attribution. Are the outcomes we're seeing, can we attribute them to the actual intervention? And this matters because when we give our evidence back to government, government then takes a decision as to whether to give the investors their money back with a return. And the returns in the UK can be really quite high. So double-digit returns are not uncommon. So it's important that we're paying for services that we're actually we're not paying for things we would have got anyway, essentially. So that's the social impact bond model. Just a quick note on terminology. So if you probably notice I'm going between social impact bond and social outcome contract. It's very interesting. Over the last 5 years, there's been a real push from government and from people leading the kind of charge on social impact bonds to change the terminology towards social outcomes contracts. And it's funny, I was kind of going through these slides again just the other day in Toronto, and I came across this researcher, Dan Cohen, who I think is based in Canada, kind of asking questions about this change in terminology. But yeah, we've certainly been pushed to start talking about social outcomes contracts rather than social impact bonds. And I think that is linked to a sense that social impact bonds themselves, the branding hasn't really worked. And there's a sense that they've really stalled. And there's a desire to rebrand them to try and get things going again. But I think it's quite telling that you know, this change in terminology has come about. So, in terms of how prevalent and significant social outcomes contracts are, since 2010 we've had around 300 SIBs or SOCs instigated throughout the world, about a quarter of which have finished and have paid out. In terms of the amount of money, it looks impressive, $760 million, but if we think about the broader budgets we have in all our countries for services, this is quite a niche policy. It's created a lot of interest, but actually, you know, it's not hugely significant compared to standard programs. About half of these programs have run in the UK, the US, and Portugal, and about a third of them in the UK. So a lot of the learning here is from the UK. But a really significant thing is over time, so they kind of, there's a graph that shows, you know, from 2010, they kind of go up and up and up and up. They kind of reach 2018, and then they start dropping down again. So partly there's the pandemic, but I think there's something more than that. I think really in recent years, governments have lost a bit of confidence that this is really the right kind of mechanism to try and get the changes, the solutions to wicked problems that they're searching for. And so with this paper, we're trying to explain that. We're trying to explain the rise and now the kind of the stall. And we don't really know where we're going next. But that should give you a sense of numbers behind the SOCs or the SIBs. Turning to this paper, we've got 3 research questions for the paper. So firstly, why are social outcome contracts attractive to policymakers in the first place? And then secondly, why are they seen as really hard to implement through the empirical literature? And then thirdly, what kind of improvements might we be able to recommend to policymakers? Any questions so far? Is that all clear? Yeah, great. So, again, in terms of where the literature is and what we understand, I think you all know Jesse's work, so I don't need to go into much detail, but there's a polarised debate, really, about whether these are things that government should be doing or shouldn't be doing. So in the early literature, there was this idea that they would be win-win-win policies. So you would get better services for service users, you would get cashable savings for government, and you would get a good return for investors, and everybody would win. So this is how they were kind of talked about early on. At the same time, you've got particularly academic critics suggesting this sounds too good to be true, it must be too good to be true, what's really going on? And even if it is something that you want to go down the route of, it's surely part of, you know, broader trends of financialisation, assetization. Is that something we want to kind of get into? There's a famous paper by Neil McHugh where he calls SIBs a wolf in sheep's clothing, which kind of, you know, this idea that they're very soft and nice, but underneath it's a way for investors to start making returns in the public sector, which previously has been quite well protected. So that's the kind of literature, the 2 polarising views in which we've been working. Recently, we've kind of moved on from this heat, this debate, and we see much more light. So thankfully there's some really good empirical work which is being done. So there's great work from the US, which emphasises the political elements, budgetary gaps, drawing on a lot of public administration theory, so work by Mildred Warner, Caroline Heinrich in particular. There's a lot of work in the UK and the EU, looking at the relational dynamics, really think about, in terms of public management reform, what CIVs tell us, and brilliant international overviews as well. There's another Canadian author, James Williams, who did a lovely piece of work comparing the UK, the US and Canada. Obviously Jesse's work and others. So we've got a deeper understanding, I think, now. We've moved on from these debates of these kind of normative debates, I think. So, to come to the theory then, so it's a paper where we're trying to explore these theoretical questions. So I think when you look at the literature, one of the things which is notable is that there's a bit of a cleave down the middle between scholars who think that social impact bonds or social outcomes contracts are kind of an extension of new public management reforms. So I think Mildred Warner talks about new public management on steroids, increased measurement and, investors being involved as well. And so there's a sense that, they will radically increase, management capacity, measurement, and marketized services. On the other hand, there's a group of scholars who look at the model and suggest, well, no, I don't think that's happening. I think what's actually happening much more is something more akin to a stewardship model or a new public governance model, which is an idea from Stephen Osborne, which is much softer, that actually social impact bonds can encourage collaboration. They've got more time for people to work together, and actually they're not an extension of new public management. They're a way to move away from some of the problems of new public management. So there's been this big debate in the literature about what they really represent in theoretical terms. With this paper, we're suggesting that a hybrid governance approach might help us move beyond this kind of polarisation. And so we're drawing on Sorensen and Torfing, so Danish scholars' ideas around hybrid governance, which essentially suggests that policymakers have got multiple tools they can draw on at different times. So sometimes hierarchy might be the best way, other times markets or networks, depending on the situation. And really it's about the skill of public managers to understand which tools to use, in which contexts, at which times. And through doing so, we can get more effective public management. But they also know that this is a difficult thing to do. So we're trying to draw on this theory to try and help us move beyond a bit or explain why we're seeing such a contested space. So we also make a distinction in the paper between social outcomes contracts as kind of theoretical policy design tools on the one hand, and then the actual nitty-gritty of implementation on the other. And what we argue in the paper is that as policy design tools, they promise to optimise the best of new public management and the best of new public governance without really recognising the paradox there and the tension between the two. So in the paper, we've got a number of tables, which hopefully you should be able to read. So again, we're drawing on Stephen Osborne's work. So Osborne has similar tables where he compares traditional public administration, new public management, and new public governance. So we've tried to do something similar here. So there's various elements. There's focus, emphasis, relationships, governance mechanism, value proposition. And so these are the key new public management elements which come from Osborne. And we've looked at the literature on social impact bonds and social outcomes contracts and tried to say, well, what is the social outcome contract element here? So in terms of the focus, a big focus from a new public management point of view is trying to professionalise the non-profit sector to take on public contracts. In terms of emphasis, a real focus on measurement, using data to drive decisions. In terms of relationships, particularly in the UK, CIVs have been seen as a way to kind kind of grow this social investment market more fully. In terms of governance, investors should be taking on the risk of implementation failure. And ultimately, the value here is, better services, cost savings, enhanced efficiency. So through this literature, we can see arguments for social outcome contracts as mechanisms for new public management. At the same time, we can look at other authors writing about social impact bonds and social outcomes contracts, and we can use the new public governance frame from Osborne, and highlight the discourse in some of these papers and these articles, which very much more align with a new public governance approach. So, for instance, social outcome contracts are collaborative. They're about partnerships, more relational contracting rather than transactional contracting. A real commitment to long-term outcome measurement rather than short-term performance management. Relationships keep coming through, flexibility, and this idea that success is collectively co-constructed amongst the different parties. So we see a much kind of softer approach through the new public governance angle. In practice, the more recent empirical literature suggests that we're not getting the best of both worlds. We're actually seeing suboptimal outcomes. There's a number of points we draw out in the paper. So one of the big things has been a consistent reduction in the commitment to long-term outcomes measurement. So we're seeing times being compressed all over in the UK in particular. So there's research showing that the social outcome contracts which are most attractive to investors, unsurprisingly, are those which are most likely to generate large, reliable returns over a shorter period. We've moved towards simpler proxy measurement rather than outcomes. And we've also seen cases of gaming throughout the social impact bonds and social outcome contracts we've looked at. So not a hugely happy picture. So in reality, what we're saying is when we take these two different frames, we can see that oftentimes social impact bonds, social outcome contracts are bringing together suboptimal aspects of new public management and new public governance. So what we see is at the kind of the performance management level, we've got very much a kind of a new public management ethos. Lots of pressure on not-for-profits to deliver, to hit targets. At the same time, we've got a really weak governance infrastructure. So the idea of competition, which would fit with a new public management model, has gone away. So there isn't competition. So we've got quite weak governance, which leads to some of the problems we've noted from the empirical work. And I think ultimately this undermines transparency. And it is one of the reasons why I think we've seen this fall off of political support for social impact bonds and social outcome contracts recently, because they're not doing what the original promise said they would. So kind of bringing this together, and this is quite a, well, I'd be interested in what you think. It might be quite a crude thing to do. We've had to kind of make a decision at a kind of performance level and a governance level. Do we think bringing the literature, the empirical literature together, we're seeing more of a new public management characterization or new public governance? What we argue in the paper is that the performance level, that the management emphasis is really kind of tight management regime, short-term measurement, rather than these long-term outcome measures which are based on attribution. So in terms of measurement, we've got a strong NPM approach. Whereas in the governance columns, we're seeing that there's really quite a weak governance arrangement. There's a lack of transparency, and we're seeing examples of gaming. So it's not a very positive picture. So I think that,
Do you want to define gaming for people?
Oh yes, sorry. So gaming would be so for instance we did some work in Switzerland comparing two programs delivered by the same by the same provider, one through social impact bond and one through conventional financing. And the results for the social impact bond were better than the conventional group. But when we kind of went and did the qualitative interviews, we found out that they were spending much more money on the social impact bond cohort. They were also picking stronger candidates to come into this. So they were gaming the system. And very interestingly, we call it institutionalized gaming because not only were the providers doing it with the support of the investors, but actually the government knew that it was going on, but it was so politically important to the government that this thing was seen as a success that they were happy to let this happen. So it's really kind of embedded. So this is what we found from the empirical data. So, is there a better way? How might we improve social outcomes contracts? So again, using this same framework, we've kind of thought about this, and I wonder how it's going to go through review. I don't know if they're going to like this or not. But essentially, what we're arguing for is we're not sort of saying there's NPM is bad, NPG is good by any means. I think we are making a case for hybrid governance. But what we think is there needs to be more of the NPG elements around the performance management and much more thought in terms of governance about the best ways to deliver services. So stronger governance models, a greater role for the state. I think the state has kind of gone missing in some of this. Much more transparency, much more accountability, and yeah, we keep coming back to this issue around long-term outcomes. I think that's your kind of safety net with these things, because that's what everyone wants. If they can demonstrate fewer people are homeless through doing this intervention over time, then that's what we all want. But if we stop really measuring that, and instead just look for proxy measures, then I think that's perhaps why we've ended up in some of the problems that we currently face. So, conclusions. So just a reminder, these were the research questions. So what's the initial attraction to SOCs? Why are we seeing them become less popular now? And how can we improve them? So, a couple of points before I get onto those questions. One of the things, a couple of things we argue in the paper is, firstly, it is quite helpful, I think, to distinguish between the policy design phase of social impact bonds, the hypothetical bit where everyone's really keen to think about how they can solve these problems, and then the reality, the policy implementation side of things. And we also make an argument in the paper to move beyond this binary debate, which we're very guilty of, because I think we've often thought in these terms, and actually think beyond new public management versus new public governance towards a more hybrid approach, whilst recognising that's difficult. So, in terms of the first research question, why are these things popular for policymakers? And I think essentially they're popular because they offer something to everyone. They offer the world. That we can. It goes back to that three wins, the win-win-win. We can deliver better services, save money, and also give a return to investors. But beyond that, they've also got this discourse of collaboration, of sharing, of co-creation, and a real nod towards new public governance as well. I think a lot of this keeps coming back to this issue around the chameleonic nature of social impact bonds. The paradoxes therein, the strategic ambiguity in the idea. Cat Smith from Glasgow She talks a lot about chameleonic ideas, and she says they're really good in the short term because everyone thinks that they can get what they want through them, but in the long term they fail to institutionalise because they're kind of built on sand, and actually you need something stronger. So I think we can understand, especially alongside the idea of investors bringing in extra finance at a time when we were living through austerity, and we still are in the UK, this extra funding is obviously attractive. So the extra funding with this kind of very attractive discourse kind of explains, I think, why they were taken up so keenly in some places, but not others. So we can maybe think about Canada. In terms of the second question, why have we seen this stall? What we argue here is it's very difficult. If you've got this kind of paradoxical, conflicting nature of your policy goals, it's very difficult to coherently deliver them. So we see that this focus on NPM in terms of performance management, much more kind of NPG in terms of weak governance without competition. We end up, I think, a lot of people who've experimented with social impact bonds in the UK are quite dissatisfied with them because they don't live up to the hype. And I think, again, the point we really want to make through the paper is we need a renewed commitment to long-term outcomes to remedy some of these problems. So that's one of the key arguments that we make. So for instance, in the UK now, a lot of social impact bonds are delivered through a rate card, whereby the government would say, we will pay an organisation £400 if you can keep, say, a 15-year-old student in school who's not had a very good attendance record before. And so they're quite easy to gain, these things. Rather than saying, we will pay you, £2,000 if you can show that that person's qualified, got into employment in 5 years' time. So I think that early promise, I think we probably need to go back to, which is kind of the final slide, really, our recommendations. So, yeah, the principal one is exactly this. We think there needs to be a reaffirmation of this commitment to long-term, properly, robustly measured outcomes. And also less pressure on community and voluntary organisations to meet these short-term targets. Ultimately, I think there needs to be a reduction in the influence of the financially focused actors. I think we need more government intervention, really, to make sure that these relationships are more balanced than they currently are. And I think that's probably central government in the UK case rather than local, but it will differ in different countries. And I think, finally, we still need more transparency. So this is something we've been asking for a very long time. We don't have much transparency over how much money is being made by investors in this. We don't have much access to contracts anymore. So we think greater transparency will hopefully improve this policy model, because I still think there is something potentially useful there if we can get the other elements right. And yeah, that's as much as I want to say. I think that's not too long.
Excellent. Yeah, great. Okay, we have lots of time for questions here. So I'd like to give the people online the first opportunity to ask questions, and I don't think anyone in this room is monitoring the chat, so I'll give you 10 seconds to speak up before I go to the people who are here in person.
Looks like there's 4 things in the chat.
I think those were there before, but we can check. Sure.
Get the people on the screen, is that possible?
Yeah, let's do that. That's a great idea. Okay, someone ask a question in the room while I'm doing this.
So I have quite an easy one, Alec.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about the temporal dimension, because I think the concept of long-term and short-term are doing a lot of work in these. And you talked about, in particular, the elision of longer-term to shorter-term as part of the gaming process. What are the time dimensions? What are you looking at? And especially from an investor point of view, what's the cycle for returns?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there's no universal answer, so they're all a little bit different. I think one of the attractive things about social impact bonds, particularly for smaller voluntary and community organisations, is they will give contracts of 3 to 5 years, whereas frequently, particularly in the UK, most small charities will just have year by year contracts. So I think that's quite attractive. Originally, if we look back to the first social impact bond in Peterborough, there was a very robust kind of experimental design, which didn't pay out until kind of 3 or 4 years after. But frequently, we've moved to this rate card approach, whereby with a rate card, we did some work with a SIB in Sheffield recently, and they would fill out their pro forma, send it back to the government department, and they would get paid, a month later. So it's moved to much more kind of frequent, early money coming back in. That can be beneficial in some ways, it can be recycled, but they're proxy measures rather than real outcomes.
Robert?
I'm going to ask the binary question, or maybe representing Greg Selinger as here to defend himself, and I'm asking the question, why bother at all? Every single study I know, meta-study I know of the United States, for-profit medicine is more expensive, less effective, and less accessible. Actually, there's no advantages at all. So why would we be interested in the private sector? I know this is not sort of with the subject. Why would we bother having them at all involved, other than it's another form of second best solutions from neoliberalism, accepting austerity? Tax them, publicly funded. The single best organization in the United States in terms of otherwise a chaotic, inefficient, inaccessible healthcare system is the healthcare for the military, the Veterans Administration.
Yeah.
It's one of the most efficient healthcare systems in the world inside the chaotic American system. And so, why would we ever essentially look for a new way of managing something which is second best? I'll stop there.
Yeah.
Do you want me to take a few questions, or do you want to just take them one at a time?
Could we do them one at a time?
Sure.
If that's okay. So I think that's a very, very obviously, valid question, and I've thought the same a lot of times. So why bother? I think we know we're not doing things right currently. We know, for instance, we've still got problems with homelessness. We know in the UK that even when that was the role of state bodies, they weren't doing it. They weren't getting it right. So we've got wicked issues that traditional public administration hasn't been able to resolve. We've got wicked issues that a new public management approach through competition hasn't been able to resolve. So I think there's a sense that this is something a bit different. So in terms of why it might be more likely to achieve it, I think it's moving beyond kind of hierarchy and competition, more towards collaboration, and getting the various actors who can make a difference in a room together, really talking through these problems and trying something different.
I'm not suggesting for a moment that improvement shouldn't occur. I'm just wondering why through social impact bonds. All the other things you're doing, I think, are very important. Governments fail to do all kinds of good things.
Yeah.
But why would we rely on public-private financing, which is going to distort? I'm not going to bother talking about why it's so efficient. Use the private sector to do it. So, well, kudos to the rest of it.
So I think because, as I say, that there are things we've tried to solve before and haven't been able to. I think part of it is that it was, you know, if you go back to the slide of David Cameron, it fit with his agenda of problems of the state haven't been solved by the state, let's try something different. I think that a lot of mistakes have been made with the social impact bond model, but I think there's ongoing work that we're involved with, which is trying to take some of the good lessons around collaboration and remove some of the more problematic ones. So we're doing some work currently which looks at taking some of the thinking around outcomes-based approaches and removing the investor altogether. So getting money from large charities and encouraging them to use their money in more diverse ways. So I think there's some learning from it. I think, you know, one of our conclusions is exactly this, that, you know, allowing financial actors too much power has been a problem. There is just this weird thing which you can't kind of capture, but there is this kind of weird, you get it when you do field work, this kind of weird magic of the social impact bond. That people, it's got a high profile nature, it's getting people to work with people from sectors they've never worked with before. You can get real change. So I did a study in South London around HIV testing, and the social impact bond was led by the Elton John AIDS Foundation, and it just had this kind of, it might have been Elton is a big name, but it just had this magic kind of sprinkled all over it, and it was hugely successful. It was to get you know, doctors and nurses in hospitals to test more for HIV. We've known about the evidence that this works for a long time. We've not been able to do it in the NHS. This new approach, giving kind of large outcome payments to hospitals and also to third sector, voluntary and community sector organisations, revolutionised how this was done. Since then, we've the NHS has started paying for this intervention itself more fully. So I think it can just act as a bit of a way to change current practice and offer something new. But I fully take your broader criticism.
If I may take Chair's prerogative for 10 seconds. So Mildred Warner, for example, has argued in like blood red Republican states, this is a way to get people who would never think about investing in early childcare, for example, through the state to do so. And she's argued that when you build in publicly funded prenatal care for women after these social impact bonds, or a commitment from the state to fund universal preschool for children within a particular income demographic, you can change minds that otherwise are inaccessible to these type of ideas. Okay, many hands up. Andrea was first.
Thanks. This is great. Thank you very much. So my question, I think, follows on the other two questions, and I'm curious about the argument that we just need longer-term focus. We need a longer-term focus.
Yeah.
And given government's time horizons, which tend not to be longer-term, and private investment, which I'm going to assume is similar, what would you see happening? What would you see as you know, sort of the underlying conditions for what would lead to a longer term focus?
So what would lead to a longer term focus? As I say, I think what I'm attracted to still about the model is this sense of collaboration, this sense of moving beyond yearly contracts which are, you know, going out to tender. There's a lot of transaction costs and all of that. So I think with the work we're doing that I mentioned earlier with partners currently, with this kind of development of the social impact bond without the investors, they're looking at kind of a 5-year commitment to a local area. And over those 5 years, they will provide some funds and some wider kind of managerial support to small voluntary community sector organisations. and they will encourage them to bid for more contracts and to shift to a focus on outcomes. So that would be like a 5-year commitment in a local health area serving maybe 1 million people, something like that. And one of the things about this money not coming from government is you're less reliant on government or changes in government to deliver it. So I would think, yeah, in terms of long-term outcomes, kind of 5 years to embed these projects. And again, if you can show improvements, another 5 years, and I think we should have a longer-term focus. So there's a lot of work in New Zealand, trying to invest for the future. It's really difficult. We've got this election next week, and both the main parties are really being dishonest, I think, about the scale of the challenges. So I think there is a space for a different approach to funding targeted services.
Thank you. Very thoughtful presentation. I really appreciate it. My question is focused on the role of nonprofits, charities, the larger voluntary sector, who often are the service delivery agents under a SIM. And in Canada, we know from the literature that the voluntary sector is often overlooked. Susan Phillips, probably our greatest scholar in voluntary sector in Canada, has called it an abject neglect that's happened. And so I guess I'm concerned about using the term collaboration in a SIM when we know from the literature, again, in Canada, that nonprofits and charities and other groups are often left to just accept what is offered to them. They're rarely invited to the public policy formulation table, and then they're just left to deliver a service that they know through experience probably won't work, but they need the money because the contracting situation and funding situation is so dire in Canada. So I'm concerned about this use of the term collaboration, because at best, it's probably a low-level collaborative effort focused on service design where the decisions are made by others, but not the nonprofit sector. And so I guess my question to you is this really collaboration?
That's a really good question, and I think you're right, often it isn't. Often it isn't. So there's a lot of talk about flexibility of social impact bonds, but flexibility for who? And it's often flexibility for the investors to change contracts if they don't like what's happening. It's flexibility for the government to say, actually, we don't want to do this anymore. And two, infrequently, it's flexibility for smaller organisations to deliver services. So I think that's absolutely right. And I think that's something which needs to be thought of much more. But I can kind of think of one example of work I've done recently where I've really seen this happen. And I can also talk about this current work we're doing, kind of this development from social impact bonds, and I think you can commit to that. So again, the work I did with Elton John AIDS Foundation, they drew just really, really brilliantly upon small charities in London who were dealing with quite niche groups who were high prevalence for HIV. So charities for men who have sex with men, who were going out and doing outreach, doing community work, charities who were helping illegal immigrants from South America get into the system. They were empowered by the model. I don't really like that kind of language of empowered, but doing the interviews with them, they really were. And they said traditionally, when we had a contract from the local authority or the NHS, they would say, pay us £1,000, you need to do 10,000 tests. There was no follow-up on how effective they were. With the social impact bond model, with the focus on outcomes, they got £5,000 for every person they identified and got back into treatment. And that radically changed their potential because they could employ new staff and they could go out, and even through COVID, they were doing outreach work, which was absolutely fantastic. And kind of answers the point earlier as well of kind of why bother with particularly the Latin American community. They wouldn't engage with NHS services because they felt that they were illegal. If they go, they're going to be sent back home, they'll be in trouble. But actually, that's not the case. The NHS will treat you. And so I think there is something about properly engaging with the community and voluntary sector. And so the second point is, with this new work we're doing currently, that's what it's all about. And there's a recognition from the cancer, so it's called Macmillan Cancer Care. They're the largest cancer charity in the UK. They're huge. They've got decades of experience working. They're doing contracts for the NHS. They're very aware that they are seen by smaller organisations as usurpers who will come into the patch and take everything away. And they see this model as an opportunity to rectify a lot of that and to really properly engage with smaller organisations, because we know that the NHS, so I speak as someone who worked in the NHS for a long time and loves it, but we're rubbish at engaging with non-statutory bodies. And so we've had a big reform of healthcare over the last few years, and there's currently a real opportunity to work more closely. Whether we will or not, I don't know, but I think it's exactly the right question about collaboration. Susan.
Well, so can I follow up on Karen's question? So just to devil's advocate from the narrative of caution. Did you say that when there was used to be a $1,000 payment, there was these less, and then they bumped it up, and then you get 5? Couldn't you got the same results by just decreasing this spending you would have done in the first place? Isn't it just a question of more funding into the system, which doesn't have to come through the different mechanisms? Sorry, that's the harsh way to put it. But.
No, and I think that's a very, very plausible. Yeah. So I don't dispute that, but what I found doing the interviews was, and that was kind of one of the questions we kind of put to them, is that they weren't able, if they were going to get, say, £1,000 for a contract for 1 year, it wasn't worth their time employing someone new, kind of deliver. Whereas with this, they were able to say, well, actually, if we can get 6 people, if we can identify 6 people, we can then employ someone full-time. It gave them much more kind of long-term assurance that they'd be able to do it. But again, with this opt-out testing for HIV, as I said, the evidence has been there for a good 10 or 15 years that we should be doing this. But it wasn't until the outcome payment approach was used that we properly incentivised hospitals, not so much the community doctors, they didn't buy into it, but the community, the small charities working in this space, they felt that was revolutionary to them. And actually, the policy's been very successful in that now the NHS pays directly for the service. They put an extra £20 million in, so more money has gone in, but I'm doing some follow-up work on this, and what we see is all that money, as always happens in the NHS, it's been hoovered up by the hospitals. So you go to the accident and emergency department and you will get that test. But the money which previously was going to it's reverted to the previous model for community organisations. So they haven't got the capacity to do the work they previously were doing, and they really, really missed the outcome payment mechanism. I think that is the problem. Just institutionally, the NHS will take that money because we need it, because our hospitals are crumbling after 14 years of austerity.
Robert, is the Labour Party doing anything, as far as I can tell, a real qualitative? I know they're going to get elected for good reason, but is there anything that, if this is not the appropriate question at this point, Is there anything they're doing that sounds useful, relatively speaking, for the public sector? Nothing outstanding, it doesn't sound like.
No, so I think what is happening is that the Conservative Party are losing the election rather than Labour winning it. And I think that's entirely, well, it's a personal opinion, but entirely appropriate. I think, you know, we're poorer, we're sicker, we are more divided as a country in 2024 than we were in 2010. I think, you know, objectively, I think that's accepted. I think Labour are running a very cautious campaign where they don't want to commit to increased funding. In truth, we've got the highest tax burden we've had for a very long time, linked to COVID, linked to Brexit. So I think there's a recognition that more money needs to go into the system, but there is a reluctance to say that publicly. I think there are certain things they will do. There's certain tax rises they haven't ruled out. I think in terms of public management reform and effectiveness, we've had so much turbulence, so much political turbulence, so many different ministers, so much turnover just of a historical nature, particularly over the last 5 years, that what Labour's saying is, you know, being boring is actually quite radical because we've had so much upheaval.
Confidence is boring.
Yes, yeah. So that's what they're running on, and they've got a 20-point lead, which says a lot about maybe them or maybe the UK. I think they will be much more effective. I think they will deliver on their promises for the health service in particular. That's my particular area of interest. So their track record from the previous government was very good on this. Again, they'll be using the private sector, I'm sure. I think there was an interesting article by Gordon Brown about a month ago now, where he talked about the need for a childhood poverty social impact bond of around £1 billion. So we'll see what that would actually look like and if that will come to fruition. So I think as well that the Labour government will be open to these kind of ideas around social outcome contracts. I think there is there's something there about bringing in other funding streams. So yeah, they're being very very cautious, but yeah, they don't need to say much. It's just there's a feeling we need change. So I think they will win. But our big debate is whether it's like Canada in 1993 and whether the Conservatives are going to beat Whitetown. Currently, current polling suggests they could be down to kind of double figures in terms of seats, which is unprecedented. But we'll see.
Fletcher.
Just I guess sort of a pragmatic implementation question. In your proposal, you're sort of pushing for the hybrid model, as I understand it. And one of the points I think you made is to try to make that sort of effective and build support for it were ways to sort of improve sort of current practice, including, you mentioned increased transparency.
Yeah.
I think and I'm wondering just how problematic that is in a practical sense.
Yeah.
I mean, part of the thing by focusing on outcomes is that you sort of leave all the messy stuff sort of in the black box.
Yeah.
And you're just sort of focusing on the outcomes. And that comes in part at the expense of the transparency. If you're trying to open that up, it seems like you're adding more costs, maybe putting more restrictions, more costs on both the monitors and the practitioners. And I'm wondering if that just starts to clog up the channels and creates a problem. So I'm wondering, transparency is, I think, one of those things that sounds great until you actually sort of see how to make it work. So it's just your thoughts, or maybe you could comment a bit more on that.
That's exactly the kind of question I'm fearing from reviewers, actually. As I was doing this, I just not looked at the paper for a while, and then I kind of came back to it, and I was like, do we make enough of this? Is our argument for hybrid governance convincing enough? So I think it's a brilliant question. I think what we want to say with the paper is that currently this idea with these contracts that they are really strategically ambiguous. They offer the world to everyone without ever being able to kind of be pinned down. We're saying that is, as I say, building on Cat Smith's work, it's brilliant to get a policy kind of launched, make it attractive to lots of people, but if you want to institutionalise it, I think you need to think much more seriously about what it is actually setting out to do and how it's going to do it. So I think my argument around the hybrid governance approach is being a bit more prescriptive about exactly what it is that these things are going to do. And at different times you'll need hierarchies, at different times you'll need networks, at different times you might need a marketised approach. But I think it's about being clearer exactly what this thing is all about. So again, to go back to the work I'm currently doing, developing this idea with colleagues about what a post-SIB might look like, kind of from the learning we've done. Really saying, well, this is about collaboration, notwithstanding the problematic nature of that, but about starting off with getting the right people in the room to really discuss what the problem is, understand the nature of it, and that requires public management skills around coordination and real robust kind of stakeholder engagement, and being really, really clear about that. But then also, I think there does need to be, if we want transparency, there does need to be a bit more bureaucracy, a bit more kind of state oversight, and that won't be attractive to some stakeholders. But I think we've got enough empirical data now so that without that, we're paying for services which we would probably get anyway. And so hopefully having this hybrid approach of being explicit that there will be different tools we'll need to draw on at different times, and outlining those a bit more in advance might be beneficial. But you're absolutely right, it could spoil that kind of the magic of what's in the black box. But I think what comes through from my reading of the hybrid governance literature is that these things are really hard, but it's unrealistic to think that just one governance principle is going to deliver what we need for really complex, wicked problems. I think we need to be adaptable, but also quite clear at the outset on how we want to try and solve these problems. Whether the review will buy that or not.
Henry.
Thank you very much. It's super interesting. So, my first question made me think about the QR context and how, a lot of colleagues have been very interested last years about the possibility of going private partnership as a way to go in public policy now that we are in a context. Well, right now we are in a very serious crisis, but before this crisis, a lot of economists were thinking about that, but just at sort of the level yet. So nobody have actually deeper into how to implement this in the QR context, which is of course very different from the global north countries. So that sort of leads me to the question about if you can sort of comment something on experiences and challenges of this type of social outcome contracts or general private partnerships in the South context. Beyond the obvious things that we can think about, like bigger institutional networks or best resources or this type of obvious things that might play or not. I'm not sure I'm familiar with the research, but and especially in experiences in which governments have not necessarily historically been weak or something, but in the global South context in which the government has had a very serious presence.
I can comment a little bit. So my own research hasn't taken place outside of kind of the UK or other European countries, but I do have colleagues who've done work on, so people call them DIBs, like development impact bonds. So I can probably point you in the direction of some of that literature, but I think my understanding from talking to colleagues who have done it is a lot of the problems which are kind of outlined about, you know, these models in the UK and US and Europe, a lot of the problems are just the same in low and middle income countries. So I think, yeah, similar problems, but I've not done research in that context, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. So, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but at the tail end, you sort of said, you know, one of the things maybe would make these a little bit better is to sort of pull back a little bit on the role of finance, or maybe eliminate the role of finance, and that makes sense given the problems you've identified, right? So, you know, the more sort of private sector finance is involved, the less transparency there's going to be. You get proprietary contracts, the more incentive there is for gaming the system, all that stuff. So that follows very nicely. I guess in a very brief two-part question, one, if you eliminate the role, or reduce or eliminate the role of finance, do you still have a social impact bond, or do you have something different? And second, if you eliminate the role of finance, where is the money coming from? I was under the impression that that was kind of the deal with social impact bonds.
Very good questions. So in terms of the first one, so without private investment, is it a social impact bond? I think what a lot of the work that we've done and reviewed kind of says no one really knows what a social impact bond is now. It's so loose and baggy that you know, that's a potential response to that. I think as well, from my own kind of empirical work, interviewing investors, there's a distinction really between you know, financially motivated investors and socially motivated ones. And I think that there probably is a place for the socially motivated investors. And often when we did interviews, they would say, well, we would be doing this anyway. We want to use our money for good locally. And even we had some interviews where they said, we would normally expect, you know, 3% back, you know, and the government's offering is 9%. So I think there is there is potentially a role for some of those kind of investors, but some of the more financially motivated ones didn't really play any part other than putting the money in, and because the government wanted it to be a success, they got a lot of money out without really doing much. I think in terms of where the money would come from if we didn't have investors, I think we would still have investors, but there would be philanthropies, big kind of grant-giving organisations. Rather than giving grants, they would give these as kind of forgivable loans, you know, where they could recycle the money if they get it back. If they don't really need to. And in a way, we're kind of seeing that already in the UK. I think for private investors, it's too small. It's not worth the, you know, I think in the early days, people talked about this being a huge thing, and let's get in there early and let's see what happens. Now I think they can see that their money could be used in other ways. So a lot of those kind of investors have moved away anyway. But say that the work we're doing currently with this big cancer charity in the UK, for them it's a way to try and use their large resources in a more effective and efficient way, and try and reach different geographical areas that previously they couldn't get to. Because I think we've had 10, 15 years of this now. If it was going to be something that finance really liked and wanted to kind of push on with, it would have happened. I think it's actually falling back into a bit of a space where can we take some of the interesting ideas of this and use the capital which we've got from philanthropies, charities, because I think as well that then resolves some of the ethical dilemmas that, say, hospitals in the NHS never felt very comfortable, you know, being in bed with investors, if you like. So So yeah, I guess that's where it seems to me things are going.
Excellent. We have one question online, and I think we only have time for this last question, so I'll read out the question. This is from Matthew McConnell. This is an MPA student. Excellent. Okay. Thank you for the fabulous presentation. From the literature I have read, one issue relating to public-private partnerships for infrastructure in Canada has been the allocation of risk to either the private or the public sector. With this in mind, my question is, from your work, who takes the blame when SIBs do not work as planned, e.g. when the desired outcome has not been met? Is it the investors, the government, the service providers, or a combination of these groups? How might the separation of accountability affect the possibility of SIB success? And this will be our last question.
Brilliant question, so thank you. Well, it makes me think of something that comes out of your book actually, where you argue that for so many of these SIBs which have been rolled out, there's very few that don't seem to pay out. So I think the burden really falls on the government in the vast majority of cases. And I think, again, it's political. These things, they take years to get set up. And, you know, they're politically sensitive. And although when we first looked at them, we thought one of the advantages would be, you know, as we kind of saw in Rikers Island, I think, that, you know, the intervention itself didn't work, so the government didn't have to pay out, and that was seen as a quite positive thing. In reality, once stakeholders have been through all the different hurdles to get a SIB actually up and running and functioning, they don't want it to fail. And I think that's why we see so few examples of SIBs that don't pay out. So I think in the UK, the government takes the risk. I think it's different in the US though. I think the US probably still has more of a commitment to more rigorous evaluation. They're more interested in experimental evaluation methods. So I think in the US it will be the investors, but the investors are often subsidised by philanthropies as well. But it's quite rare, I think, for investors to lose out in this space. And I suspect as well, something we don't talk about in the paper, because I've got no firm evidence for it, but I suspect that treasuries have looked at this and thought actually this discourse around cash savings just isn't true. And I think one of the reasons they've stalled in the UK, they were, you know, in the early days, right at the heart of government with David Cameron in the Cabinet Office. They've now been filtered through. They're in a much less powerful department. And so I think the Treasury probably looked at it and thought that, you know, these things aren't really moving risk away because the investors don't want to necessarily take on that risk unless they've got you know, an ethical commitment which a charity or a philanthropy might have, if that answers the question.
Excellent. That brings us right to time. Thank you everyone for your participation. We had a great online participation, over 20 people at our peak. So let's just thank Alec one more time for his time.